Hello, everyone. Thanks for waking up the crowd, Tarek, after lunch. It's a real pleasure to be here at this conference. Thank you so much to all the organizers for inviting me and also just for organizing everything so well. It really is appreciated. Thanks also to Tarek for such a powerful and important appraisal of how anti-Semitism works to shut down criticism of Israel and a real precise analysis of the geopolitics of that. Right. So, in 2016, Ken Livingstone, a former Labour mayor of London, became what I like to think of as patient zero in what would become Labour's anti-Semitism crisis. He was defending a Labour MP who'd been accused of sending anti-Semitic messages on social media. But the bit that set everything off was when Livingstone said this, quote, "When Hitler won his election in 1932, his policy then was that Jews should be moved to Israel. He was supporting Zionism before he went mad and ended up killing 6 million Jews." Livingstone's reference point was the controversial Ha'avara agreement made between a Zionist Jewish organization and Nazi Germany in 1933, a point that he labored during the media tour that followed his comments. I won't go into that here, but I can tell you that the incident did spark various media articles explaining that, no, this agreement did not mean that Nazis were Zionists. I can tell you that I, a longtime fan of the socialist former mayor, Ken Livingstone, and his achievements in my home city, London, found myself on media panels trying to explain why Livingstone had got it wrong, alongside other socialists trying to explain that technically he was right. They say you should never meet your heroes, but maybe you should also never ask them for their pet theories about Hitler. It was the first taste of what would become viscerally familiar for over the next 4 years. A series of allegations of anti-Semitism within Labour, followed by evasions, counterclaims, and dismissals. Anti-Semitism became a political football in the endless factionalism of the UK Labour Party, with the right wing of the party implacably opposed to the left-wing Corbyn leadership from the start. It was also a wedge issue used by the political right to discredit and to divide the left. But that bit should not be a surprise. That is literally how politics works. But Labour's anti-Semitism crisis was also real. It was a real problem. Yes, it did dominate the news cycles disproportionately and at fever pitch. But as the British socialist lawyer David Renton wrote in his book on the subject, this campaign could not have lasted had it not been for the reality that the press and Labour supporters were repeatedly able to find instances of behaviour which was either anti-Semitic or within touching distance of it. The press, the Labour right, and the Conservatives could not have successfully made a story out of the anti-Semitism crisis had it not been for the experience of Jews and others who found prejudice in parts of Labour's base. My own view is that the issue snowballed into a full-blown crisis because the besieged Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, disastrously mismanaged the issue, allowing it to spiral out of control. But for progressives, the outcome was horrendous. It produced even less understanding over anti-Semitism, which already is really poorly understood in Britain. It marginalized Islamophobia and anti-black racism in a country where structural racism is rife and which is deeply resistant to exploring its own terrible legacy of colonialism and slavery. This significantly was an impossible reality for Jews of color, who often faced attacks against both aspects of their identity. Devastatingly, this entire sorry saga was a chill factor on any discussion of Palestinian rights and the injustices of Israel's occupation, military aggressions, and routine flouting of international law. Every aspect of this mess was intensely distressing, confusing, and isolating for Jewish supporters of the Corbyn leadership and political project. That includes me, a journalist who often appeared during that period on current affairs programs on TV, discussing the Labour Party. But how on earth did it come to this? Corbyn's unexpected leadership was a big shock to Britain's political system, which since the early 1980s had cleaved to a neoliberal consensus of free market economics pursued by both the main political parties. An anti-war socialist with a firm stance on redistributive economic policies, tax the rich, renationalize utilities. Corbyn was also strongly allied with the Palestinian cause. His leadership win prompted an unparalleled surge in party membership, but he was less enthusiastically received, to put it mildly, by the press and some of his own party members. This is crucial context because it meant that Corbyn's supporters were accustomed to defending his leadership against constant and often spurious attacks. Among the list of things he was castigated for by the press were, I think there's a, oh. Do I have to point it this way? Well, anyway, you'll just have to take my word for it. You'll be like, no, we don't believe you. Show us the image. So, among the list of things he was castigated for by the press were not bowing deeply enough at a Remembrance Day service. There he is. There's the service. Not singing the national anthem at a memorial. And this one blows my mind. Riding a supposedly communist bicycle. An actual article in an actual respectable British newspaper. He was falsely accused of being a communist spy. That media confection ran for weeks, and he was routinely denounced as a Marxist extremist intent on bankrupting Britain. It's really quite difficult to capture the hysteria that characterized UK reporting about this mild-mannered socialist leader who professed to enjoy jam making and growing marrows on his allotment, and who wanted to introduce the horror Scandinavian-style redistributive economic policies to Britain. So, when claims of anti-Semitism started to hit, Corbyn's supporters understandably just saw that as one more in the list of ridiculous claims made against the Labour leader. And so they would deny or downplay the anti-Semitism in order to defend him. One shocking example of that came over an anti-Semitic mural painted, actually, there is an image. There it is. I'm so happy that worked. Painted on a London wall by artist Mir One, this mural featured a group of fat, hook-nosed businessmen playing Monopoly on a table held up on the backs of black men. They were essentially counting money on the backs of ethnic minorities. Now, in 2012, Jeremy Corbyn offered support via a Facebook comment to Mir One, whose mural was to be removed. When, in 2018, the comment was unearthed, as inevitably it would be, the initial statements from Corbyn's office were that he had defended the mural on the basis of free speech, before eventually conceding that the image was, quote, deeply disturbing and anti-Semitic and could not, in fact, be justified in free speech terms. This foot-dragging response was typical. As the British leftist journalist Owen Jones described in his book, This Land, which tells the story of the Corbyn project, he wrote, it was a classic failing of the Corbyn era. resisting taking an unavoidable step, then suffering self-inflicted damage and gaining no credit whatsoever for finally bowing to the inevitable. But in prevaricating like that, Corbyn created space for some of his supporters to deny that there was any problem with the mural, sometimes actively deploying anti-Semitism to do so. They did it by way of reflexively defending the Labour leadership. So, in other words, the way that this row played out and the toxic dynamics underpinning it actually made the issue of anti-Semitism worse. Several people I spoke with over this period, including Corbyn-supporting campaigners and officials, would describe watching people on social media get radicalized into deploying anti-Semitism. Corbyn-supporting social media pages and the Twitter sphere were swarming with such examples. It was as though every day brought news of a Corbyn-supporting MP, local councillor, organizer, or political official who had come out with anti-Semitism, however inadvertently. And many Jewish members, again, including many Corbyn supporters, would tell me how such language and denialism would surface at local Labour meetings, where trying to raise concern over it would be an untenable minority position. One woman who tweeted about an anti-Semitism complaint she had filed to the party not being dealt with was called, quote, disgusting and, quote, a piece of shit. She was told she was being paid to lie. She was sent cartoon depictions of Jews, which she noted her grandparents would readily recognize as Nazi in content. A young activist with the Jewish Labour Movement, a group whose affiliation with the Labour Party dates back to 1920, was yelled at during the party's annual conference and accused of being a racist and secretly working for the Israeli government. He was, he said, compared to Goebbels, called a cockroach, and generally accused of being an enemy from within. Looking back at it now, one low point that sticks in my mind is a complaint Labour received over a tweet from a party member. This person had shared an image taken from a white supremacist website and described it as, quote, the most accurate photo I've seen all year. The image was of a Statue of Liberty, its face suffocated by a grotesque alien creature with a Star of David on its back. The Corbyn ally in charge of the unit investigating such complaints wondered if the image was anti-Israel and not anti-Semitic, and recommended against this member's suspension from the party. Another was when the Jewish Labour MP Luciana Berger left the party in 2019 over what she said was, quote, a culture of bullying, bigotry, and intimidation. Here was a woman MP who had for years been the target of relentless anti-Semitism coming mostly from the far right and resulting in prison cases for 3 of the people perpetrating such abuse. Instead of solidarity and support, Berger then became a target for relentless anti-Semitism and abuse, mostly coming from the Corbyn left. And even after she left, the terrible significance of what had just happened did not sink in. Her departure was dismissed. Oh, well, it's because she came from the non-Corbyn part of the party. It's because of her pro-EU position on Brexit. It's because, of course, inevitably, she must be working for the Israel lobby. But let's back up a bit, because I think it's really important to debunk a myth that became an all too common characteristic in the media in the UK during this crisis. The UK left is not especially or uniquely anti-Semitic, even while there may be specific ways in which such prejudice does show up within the left. That much is highlighted in some of the work of academics at the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, including one David Feldman, who will be speaking at this conference later today. They locate anti-Semitism not in an individual failing, but rather, as is the case with any other racism, as a reservoir of stereotypes and narratives filled over time and from which people can readily draw. Anti-Semitism, just like any other racism, is an animating force that permeates our societies and can be activated by populist politicians, as we have seen. But polling from Jewish Policy Research, a UK think tank, shows that 13% of Brits agree with the statement, Jews think they are better than other people. 12% agree that Jews have different interests and get rich at the expense of others. 8% say Jews have too much power in Britain. The think tank found that 15% of the British population holds two anti-Semitic attitudes. Another 15% holds one of these views. But crucially, it found that members of the Labour Party are no more likely to hold such views than members of the Conservative Party. As Feldman and others at the Birkbeck Institute have written, when anti-Semitic tropes surface in the left's political conversation, this does not happen because Labour members are committed anti-Semites, but because Jews intersect or are perceived to intersect with some of the key issues they care about: Israel and Palestine and the operation of power within capitalist society. The academics cite the pollsters YouGov, who found that a quarter of Labour members will agree with the statement, quote, Israel can get away with anything because its supporters control the media. This, by the way, is why the fixation on individuals being anti-Semitic rather than knowingly or unwittingly drawing on deep reservoirs of prejudice is facile and unhelpful. It's also why a zero-tolerance approach to dealing with anti-Semitism, which has been the Labour response, is self-defeating. Rather than disciplinary procedures and chucking people out of parties, we need awareness and education. That Jeremy Corbyn was not personally anti-Semitic and yet still mismanaged this issue tells us something about potential blind spots within the left more generally. That blind spot clearly is a problem in and of itself, but also in downplaying or ignoring anti-Semitism in its own ranks, the left compromises its moral authority on other issues, from the devastating consequences of Britain's Middle East policy to the effects of structural racism and economic austerity. But while chunks of the left dramatically underplayed this issue, the right, inside and outside of the party, as well as Britain's Jewish communal bodies, dramatically overplayed it. And it was this tug of war between these oppositional forces that added to the general toxicity of how this issue showed up in British politics. To me, one clear example of the hyperbole over Labour anti-Semitism was a joint editorial from three of Britain's Jewish newspapers in the summer of 2018, declaring that Corbyn posed, quote, an existential threat to Jewish life in this country. An absolutely incredible claim to make at a time when the real, material, existential threats to Jewish life across Europe are coming from the far right. Then, in the midst of the 2019 general election campaign, the UK's chief rabbi declared that the then Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, had allowed, quote, a poison sanctioned from the top, end quote, to take root in the party. Ephraim Mirvis, who represents 62 of the UK's Orthodox synagogues, castigated Corbyn's, quote, utterly inadequate response to the party's anti-Semitism crisis and asked people to vote with their conscience. In other words, not Labour. Now, these claims were being made at a time when the electoral choice was between Corbyn's Labour or the hard Brexit, populist right nativism of Boris Johnson's Conservatives. Who won? And in whose hellscape we have been living ever since. It was in this context, it was in a context of minorities in the UK reporting a significant increase in racial discrimination since the EU referendum vote. By that time, the Conservative Party were mired in Islamophobia, a across the party and coming from the top. Boris Johnson in 2018, as Foreign Secretary, said that Muslim women wearing burqas, quote, look like letterboxes. In the week that followed that comment, there was a 375% spike in anti-Muslim incidents in Britain. In government for 10 years, the party had already caused the Windrush scandal, by which it had detained, denied legal rights, jobs, housing, healthcare, and in some cases deported people who had arrived, often as children, as British citizens from Caribbean countries, the Windrush generation. In this context, what are we to make of the claim that it was actually Labour's failures over anti-Semitism that had, in the words of the chief rabbi, put the very soul of the nation at stake? And what about the millions of people who vote Labour in the UK for many different reasons, including domestic policies? Are they also guilty of moral failure? Meanwhile, if the Islamophobia and anti-black racism of the Conservatives was not a factor in this calibration over morality, what about the Conservative Party's shocking track record over anti-Semitism? We have the Conservative MP William Rees-Mogg tweeting a video speech from the co-leader of the far-right AfD, thereby elevating and sanitizing the party. He also described billionaire philanthropist George Soros as a Ramona funder-in-chief, referring to funding of the campaign to remain in the EU, a comment cribbed from the anti-Semitism playbook. Conservative MP Suella Braverman invoked the barely disguised term cultural Marxism in 2019 with little comment, and indeed was subsequently made Attorney General. Is it too much to ask that on anti-Semitism, the Conservatives are treated with the exact same scrutiny as Labour? The abject refusal and failure of the British media political ecosystem to do so made it practically impossible to present the case that the scrutiny of Labour over anti-Semitism was not purely political, but actually had some substance. And of course, and as Tarek described so well, this was all happening in the context where supporters of the Israeli status quo do routinely use claims of anti-Semitism to shut down justifiable and legitimate criticism of Israel. Again, the progressive left should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, should be able to calibrate the difference between manifestly real anti-Semitism and bogus claims. But at the same time, it's just a reality that there is very little awareness of anti-Semitism in the UK in general, and is just the political reality, again, as Tarek described so well, that false claims of anti-Semitism by supporters of status quo Israel do not just succeed in shutting down legitimate criticism of Israel, though obviously that is bad enough. Such claims also make it harder to fight actual anti-Semitism. So all of that completely collapsed the political sphere for a left wing that is intersectional in its anti-racism and also committed to defending Palestinian rights. As I said at the start, I think a lot of this was down to blind spots, unforced errors, strategic mismanagement, and often just maddening stubbornness and pig-headedness from the Corbyn leadership. It did not have to be this way. Corbyn's leadership of Labour represented a radical change for British politics and a threat to the vested interests of the British elite. It would have been attacked no matter what. But the way to withstand such attacks is not with the besieged bunker mentality pursued by the Corbyn team. It's to build alliances that have your back. Some politicians do get that and have acted upon it in a way that is both instructive and inspiring. and they are the ones that I want to briefly draw on in closing. I look to UK Labour MP Naz Shah and Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar, each in separate instances accused of using anti-Semitism in criticism of Israeli aggressions. Tellingly, neither politician got defensive or issued denials. Neither had armies of their supporters go on about how actually they were lifelong anti-racists, which became the habitual refrain around Corbyn. Instead, they found out what had caused the problem. They sought out progressive Jewish allies. They dropped any offensive terminology without for one moment diluting their principled objections to Israeli policies. Now, often when I draw on these examples in the UK, some on the left have responded that it's ridiculous since in neither case did it stop relentless, vicious, and often Islamophobic attacks on those two politicians. Well, of course not. It's grim and depressing, but those attacks won't stop. But I think these two inspiring politicians signal something else, which is that the only politically effective and credible thing to do is to build solid, supportive alliances in the face of such attacks. The task is to grow a strong social and political base for the left so that it can win despite such attacks, and to do so with the inclusive, progressive values that should be at the core of a truly sustainable and credible left-wing political project. Thank you.